Welcome to Energy Stew. This is Peter Roth, your host. And I'd like to ask you, how does love demonstrate itself amidst all the struggles of life? In a positive way or a negative way? How do you hold it? Where do you experience oneness? Where do you experience grace or not? And so let's look at the meaning of love amidst life's turmoils with the author of the book, and he's back again on the show, God in Love on Route 80, The Hidden Mystery of Human Connectedness, Stephen G. Post. Stephen, welcome back to Energy Stew.
Thank you, Peter. I'm honored.
Well, I'm honored to have you on because your work is so profound, and I love talking with you because this is all about love and how it manifests in our lives in ways that many people don't identify it. And I think one of your jobs in life is to help people identify it.
Right.
And so what's interesting is that you're a full professor in at least one medical school, if not two, and yet you're not a medical doctor. And to me, that says a lot about what you're bringing to the field of medicine that is needed. And also you have worked with the UN. You know, you get around with your messages about, let's call it infinite mind and human connectedness and universal love. So,
I've been very fortunate to have opportunity to work with many, many aspiring young medical students, beginning at Chicago and then in Ann Arbor, and 20 years in Cleveland at Case Med, and now 11 years at Stony Brook, just out on Long Island on the North Shore. I've always felt called to, in practical ways, encourage them to realize fully that love heals. They learn a lot of science, and look, science, as you know, has just gotten so sophisticated in the last 40 or 50 years, it's almost ineffable. But imagine if the healing power of love was also making that kind of progress in our healthcare systems, in our clinical environments. That's where we need to go. I think in 30 or 40 years, we'll look back on this period, which unfortunately leaves an awful lot of patients feeling very over-objectified and very over-biologized.
right.
And not connected with for their experience and their subjectivity and their illness. But they become puzzles. If your house, you're trying to figure out a puzzle, or they become something to fix. But what we don't connect with is their narrative, even though everybody knows that's what we need to do. I mean, you go back to 1925 and the famous lecture at Harvard Med School, Peabody's The Secret to the Care of the Patient is in Caring for the Patient. We know that, but have we really made progress? And it's been mixed at best. But I do think that now people are much more focused on this, and medical schools, including our own, are actually being recognized by accrediting agencies because they create a culture of compassionate care, not just for patients, but also on interprofessional teams and so forth. We're actually the first med school to ever be acknowledged by the visiting committee from the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, that does the accrediting, for creating a culture of compassion.
I love that.
Which
And
is the thing.
Actually, I have a good friend right now who's in a very difficult chemo series, and she thinks her doctor is extremely caring, and it gives her hope. And I've done shows with Dr. Bernie Siegel. I was even a guest on his show one time, which
Uh-huh.
was a great honor. And he believes that you can identify the people who will get better from how much wholeness they experience in themselves.
Yeah, so I like love medicine and miracles. I used to run a cancer support group at university hospitals in Cleveland on Wednesday nights. And it was for people who had had very serious forms of skin cancer. And they were all, this was going back now 20 years, okay? They were all reading Love, Medicine, and Miracles, and they would talk with each other. We had about 20 people around a big seminar table about hope and how they had to visualize their cancer cells as foam on the top of the sea, a kind of a gray foam, and then a shark would come along and gobble that up and it would disappear. So they were always utilizing their imaginations creatively in exercises focused on hope. And I think that's great, but within limits, because sometimes, I would encounter people in those groups who had relapsed and relapsed very significantly, and they tended to blame themselves too much. I mean, hope is key. It has a biological impact. There's a mind-body dynamic that's been well discussed by Jerome Groopman and others. There's no question about it. But within limits, because no one, if you've noticed, no one gets out of life alive, and we're all frail, and we have telomeres that shorten with time and make us more susceptible to things. And so hope is really, really, really important, and we should cultivate it. And we have ways of trying to cultivate it in our cancer support for survivor groups, and they're much bigger now than they were 10 or 15 years ago. We have whole programs for support of these populations, and we're just trying to better understand what works with them. But hope within certain limits, and so that people don't feel that, well, somehow they didn't hope enough.
Right, that they weren't enough.
Yeah.
And I think so much of healing has to do with the power of self-love. And often I feel when I'm working with people and talking to people in trouble, that you can experience often their lack of self-love.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can't hold the light, the oneness, or let's say, the infinite mind that it takes to draw on maybe a greater power. And even then, as you say, we all have limits. We're all mortal. And so where does our love hold itself together when even hope can't keep us alive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think of love in pretty simple terms. I knew of a psychiatrist at the University of Chicago, Harry Stack Sullivan, and he said, when the happiness and security of another is as real to us as our own, he sometimes said as meaningful to us as our own, we love that person. But the key thing is that self-love is still the standard of the love of others. In other words, we're not talking about some blessed rage for self-immolation here. We're really talking about self-compassion, about giving oneself a break. I was surprised that 4 or 5 years ago in the New York Times magazine section, there was a sad article about a neonatal intensive care unit nurse who had made a medical error, and it did result causatively in the death of a young baby. and she had no place to go with it. She had no way to process it, which was tragic. Now we have code lavender programs. We have all sorts of opportunities for people to talk about, some of the mistakes they made and how to cope and deal with that. It's very, very important.
Right. Medical personnel will often have the highest suicide rates.
Well, this gal did kill herself. There's an article in the New York Times about it. And I felt so sad. That's why we do, like at Stony Brook, I actually conduct what we call reflection rounds for a lot of the residency programs, because the residents sometimes are under so much pressure. And if they make a mistake, there was a resident who made a pretty significant mistake. I won't go into any details, but it was a very significant mistake. And it was an easy diagnosis that was missed, and the results were catastrophic. And he was just almost ready to quit medicine, and he was in total despair. And we just met with him. We had a small lavender group, and we talked with him sensitively and loved him. And I said, I was down at Lexington, Kentucky a couple of years ago at the University of Kentucky, and I met a neonatologist who, like any doctor, had made his fair share of mistakes. And he had a sign on his desk, and it said, "Those who make no mistakes make nothing."
Uh-huh.
And that became the theme of about an hour and a half session. And this guy, but everybody, there were 7 or 8 of us in the room, everybody was able to process this and kind of acknowledge this as a reality. And so people need help. They need to be able to love themselves despite the fact that we are living imperfect lives. I don't like the spirituality of perfection, by the way, Peter. I mean, I think if you go for that, you're not gonna have much of a life, and you're not gonna be able to connect with anybody in an enduring fashion, because this is where AA is very insightful. The whole spirituality of imperfection. We have to recognize that and accept one another, not just tolerate, but accept and be there and make time in our lives to just listen attentively. That's what we teach here. We teach students about attentive listening. We give them exercises. We give them simulated learning experiences with patients who aren't really patients, but they're actors who are paid in the role as patients, and they give people feedback. And we talk not just about cognitive empathy. You can buy, by the way, empathy apps now online. They just,
Wow.
Oh yes, anybody would have a hard time with that. Oh yes, right. But we talk about affective presence and how to express that, and how to make people feel that you're there as a whole person, trying to heal them in a whole way. And we do a lot of innovative things that get followed around the country happily, because that's really what we need. We need the great revolution in education and clinical practice. The other day I was in the delivery area, and there was a woman who'd had a miscarriage, and she was really, really struggling. I mean, this to her was the death of a child, and she tried for a long time to have a child, and it hadn't been successful. And there was this great nurse who you wouldn't realize that she thought of herself as a wounded healer, but she came into the field as a delivery nurse because she had such a heart for these patients. And she didn't lead with this, but just sort of at the end, as the woman was going home with her husband, she kind of quietly said, I didn't want to mention this earlier because this is your journey and not mine, but I had your experience some years ago, and it's really, really difficult. And I just want you to know that I've been with you, and I feel with you. I don't have any easy answers, but I'm there, and I've been there. And just leaving it at that, not overstating it, not sort of injecting her experience into that woman's experience, but just letting that patient know that, hey, this is a journey that I've traveled, and I travel it with you.
Well, I think the importance is to understand that it's natural, even though it feels so unnatural to have had these terrible experiences. It happens to so many. Let's say life, the tragedies of life are as uncommon as they all look to each individual. Through history, there have been, many terrible times,
Mhm.
and that's the human experience. So I think it's the dream of, let's not call it perfection, but let's call it living harmlessly. And all of a sudden there's harm. And how do we hold that in the experience of a God, or some higher intelligence that works with us synchronistically in life? Where is the synchronicity when it didn't work this time?
I was doing an interview about God and Love on Route 80 with a woman from Vancouver, Canada. This was about 2 months ago. And she'd been having a really, really rough time. She works in an asylum with severely ill patients. And she was totally, totally burned out and really beside herself. And her first comment was, so how do you help someone like me have at least some small feeling for the possibility of synchronicity in the universe?
And that's an understandable remark.
It very much is. And so, my feeling is, sometimes people write big books about what theologians call, theodicy. How do you explain that bad things happen to good people? And, Rabbi Kushner's book is a very good pastoral treatment of that. And it's important. And a lot of times, you're right, as in the case of your friend, people will get a severe diagnosis and they'll start blaming God. They'll think that somehow this is, the work of an evil deity of some kind or another. I don't like the question of theodicy. I just think we have to recognize that we are frail, mortal creatures. We all suffer losses, disappointments, illnesses of every kind. And somehow to think that we can get through life without this, it's completely irrational.
Right. And actually, I have this philosophy about the purpose of life,
Mm-hmm.
is that our souls come here to work through darkness to find light, and that adds light to the universe. And that's the greater purpose of life.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, my old friend Sir John Templeton wrote about that many times, that the whole purpose of life is spiritual growth. And sometimes things will hit you like a hammer. And actually, you can grow a lot in those moments. The great theologian Soren Kierkegaard, who coined the term anxiety. Everybody uses the word anxiety in psychiatry today.
Common.
Yeah, he actually wrote a book called The Concept of Anxiety like 200 years ago, And he said, what we do in life, and the Buddha would agree, we just get into the routine, So I'm getting up in the morning, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm taking a shower, I'm having some blackberries and yogurt, I'm getting in the car, I'm coming to the university, I'm parking, I'm going up the old stairs. Everything is just routinized. And it's smooth, it's not bad. Things kind of follow along chronologically, and I'm doing some good in the world. It's not utterly meaningless, but the trouble is we get so much into these grooves and routines
that we're attached to.
We're attached to them. And it's a false security. So Kierkegaard said, you're happy on one level, but underneath it all, he was an existentialist. We have this sort of nagging fear that it's all going to evaporate, and it all will evaporate.
Right, we can step into the next manhole.
Absolutely. And the Buddha said the same thing. The Buddha said, look, everybody is suffering. Now, he didn't mean that people were, moping on the street corners left and right. But what he meant is that at a deep internal level, we all know that the things that make us happy today, it could be our loved ones, it could be so many things, that they will eventually evaporate. And so we're all suffering anxiety. The Buddha and Kierkegaard were very close. This sort of nagging, unspoken anxiety. But then Kierkegaard said, sometimes when you get really sick, when you get that really bad diagnosis, it's like a tsunami wave blowing in through the back porch. Everything is upset. It's like you're in a flood in New Orleans. I mean, everything is gone, and everything that was routine is no longer there, and you have to completely recreate, sort of ex nihilo, your life. And Kierkegaard thought that that's when you can come into growth, that's when you can come more deeply into the presence of this divine energy, because you can rely on it. This is when you know that you weren't relying on the right things. You were relying on your routine, on your alarm clock,
Right.
But now you don't have that. And so you have anxiety, you have insecurity, and you have to reattach. And what do you reattach to? Well, you attach to this deeper presence, this deeper
to spirit
energy in the universe. And it's actually sometimes very constructive. That's why they say there are no atheists in foxholes. Well, there are plenty, by the way. That's not quite true. But
that's all about religion.
It's about religion. And we don't. Yeah. But just the sense that in illness we can come into deeper, more intentional focus with regard to our inner light.
Right, and often in illness, we see the love of others, of other people show up, and that gives us a connectedness that actually it reveals the higher connectedness of life and of the universe.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I work a lot with the Alzheimer's community, really for.
I know. I really want to do a show with you on your work with Alzheimer's and dementia, because you've realized and bring to awareness a light about it that most people don't understand.
Yeah, and I mean, so my grandmother Post died of what was probably Alzheimer's disease, and it was in the sort of the mid to late 70s, and people really didn't even use the word Alzheimer's back there. She was squirrely, she had dementia, she was senile.
Right. And it's hard to define the difference unless you cut open the brain.
It surely is. It surely is.
By the way, we're running late, and we're not overtime, but we just have a few more minutes.
But the silver lining, I did assisted oral feeding with her in a nursing home. And what I discovered, of course, you can say, well, it's a burden and so forth. Well, I would just visit, weekly. And what I discovered was that she would surprise me. I had to be open to surprises. Just sporadically, she would call me by name. And I had a sense that she was much more there spiritually than gone. And I began to recognize a kind of dignity in deep forgetfulness.
Yes, and that's what I want to explore more with you in the future, because I think on so many different levels, we identify limitation in ways that there's really light there. And in so many ways, including all the love that's poured into people when they're ill, from their families, their communities, neighbors show up that they never thought of before, and all of a sudden there's love expressed.
When I read essays from students who are applying to medical school, I have to tell you that 90% of them begin with, the illness experience of a loved one and how that motivated them to become healers.
Fascinating.
90%, if not 100. I mean, sometimes I think it may be 100%.
Yeah, my father's death put me on this path of
Right.
spirituality.
Yeah.
So, but we're really getting near the end of the show. So you have a website that people should explore. Stephen G. Post, right?
Yeah, Stephen with a PH, it's the Irish spelling.
StephenGPost.com, right?
Yes.
And so there's so much that you have to offer. And your book, God and Love on Route 80, is how I found you, and loved reading the book. There's so much in there, and it's that experience of just going through life, feeling guided, but not understanding. It's not obvious, but there's a deeper place in you that follows the guidance.
Yeah. And if you just follow your own goals and think that they're absolute, then you miss your destiny.
Right. So it's operating more from a heart level than from a head level.
Right.
Yeah. And so you really exhibit that on every level. So I'm hoping to soon talk with you again, because it's so joyful to hear you speak about all of this. So thank you for being on Energy Stew.
Thank you for having me, Peter, and it's a delight. It's a total delight. Wishing you well.
Thank you. And this is Peter Roth, your host of Energy Stew at prn.fm. I can be reached at peter@heartriver, HEART river.org. I'd love to hear from you, and thanks so much for listening.